No idea how this came about, how I found it. I just found it on eBay. Anyway, what it is a stamp, and it is a stamp, original stamp. It's not a facsimile, a fake, from 1951. That's when I was 3 years old. And what I bought was a sheet of 50 of them, and this is what is on it. Whoa! And so this is the United States postage, 1951, 3 cent. Washington saves his army at Brooklyn. That was last week at Brooklyn Heights. So I'm going to have Grace. If you, and by the way, I got the sheet, and Grace cut each of these individually out, one for each of y'all. Okay. So if you'll hand these out, I'll let her do that. Yeah, just pass them right on down. Yeah, 3 cents. Yeah, 1951. That's 3 years after my birth and 8 years after the end of the war, World War II. All right. We online? Okay, so welcome to those watching online. And as everybody knows, now this is week 5, but the other 4 are all on VCF Facebook, VCF Church Facebook, and also on VCF Church YouTube. So you can go back and rewatch, or if you haven't seen it before, to catch up on this one, including this one. All right, does everybody have one now? All right, if you'll hold them there, Grace, for if anybody comes in a little bit late, okay? As I mentioned, at the end of tonight, you will get a handout sheet, a one-page summary of tonight, and it's called No Equal. And by the time we finish, you'll know exactly why I entitled it No Equal. Okay, so we've dealt with 4 weeks so far, and help me here. What was the one that started with A? What's the little thing to help you remember? Answered prayer that saved the American colonies. B, our bravery, battlefield bravery, George Washington. C, yeah, courage, creativity, and a whole lot of cannons. Okay, what is this? Oh, they up there? Oh, whoa, 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 whoa! All right. D is what? In divine deliverance. Yes. Okay. You guys got helped out here on this one here. But if you just remember those, actually, they do help. They do help in the process. Okay, so the 3 individuals, 4 weeks, but really 3 individuals. Thomas Prince, the preacher from Boston, whose prayer saved the American colonies back in 1745. I think I said Battle of Monongahela earlier. I think in the first service I said it was 1745. It's 1755. Then George Washington, and then we looked at Henry Knox. Okay, and so those are the 3 of the 4 weeks. And last week was this first big battle, and the first of our miracles that happened actually within the American Revolution. So tonight we're going to take it further, and really what I want to help you to see is that, as a matter of fact, go ahead and put up the map, because we're going to be referring to this tonight. The battles of Trenton and Princeton, but actually there was 2 battles of Trenton. They call it Trenton 1 and Trenton 2. We'll take a look at that tonight. But down here is Trenton. Now you see that blue right there? That's the Delaware River. So when we talk about George Washington, we'll see he goes across the Delaware. Okay, and then he's going to end up all the way up here at Princeton. That's about 12 miles from Trenton to Princeton, and that will be what the King of Prussia, I'll read it again later, said was concerning the dates of December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, the 10 most important days in history. Okay? Okay, so let's start it by making some comments about last week. Following the 3 providential miracles of the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, that's what you got the stamp from, General Washington and his troops were chased through New York, through New Jersey, until they finally got to the Delaware River. He went over. He took his remaining troops over the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, and right on the opposite side of it is Trenton. This distance between where he came across the Delaware River, and Trenton was 9 miles. That will become significant because it's going to be a 9-mile walk, and you'll hear about the weather conditions to pull off what is part of what is considered this miraculous 10 days recorded. Okay, so they are, if you recall, okay, August 27th was the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. We're now at December 25th. So you got 4 months. During that 4 months, the British are chasing the American forces through New York, through New Jersey, and then right around Christmas, they end up at Trenton. We cross over, the Americans under George Washington cross over into Pennsylvania, and the British say, no, we're not going to go any further. It's the heart of winter. We're going to wait here till later in the year. What they don't know is that that's not going to be what George Washington has planned, okay? Skirmishes took place during this 4-month period where the Americans are being chased, leading up to the end of the year. Because of the harshness of the winter, the British halted their pursuit of the Americans at Trenton, New Jersey, okay, which is the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It was at this moment, nearing the end of December 1776, that General Washington made a decision which would renew the hope amongst the Americans and actually turn the whole American Revolution around. As you recall last week at the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, if the Americans had been destroyed, if 3 miracles had not transpired, can anybody give me the first of the 3 miracles that happened on August 27th? What? Yeah, the ships were kept up out of New York harbor. They were kept out by this storm. Okay, the storm came up, kept those ships out. Would you give one to Donna back there? Here's your little present for you. And that's the real deal. It's truly the 1951 stamp. And here comes somebody else. We're going to keep you busy. Okay, Goody and Philip, give them each one. We've got a special gift. This is from 1951. This is the real deal. It's not a copy, and it's a stamp that was issued and what it was the 175th anniversary. Come on, you ain't got to sit there. 175th anniversary of the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. So if you look at the stamp, Philip, that's the real stamp from 1951. I was 3 years old. And that is a picture it is a true stamp, a 3-cent stamp issued by the government, and it shows George Washington on his horse over Brooklyn. It says they saved the army, right? All right, okay, so we're up to date here now. I just mentioned Washington decided to risk everything because they needed a victory. Their army was now down to 2,000 men. Okay, and that was for 3 reasons. The amount of men they lost at the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, then in these skirmishes for 4 months, men they lost there, and then interestingly, the third reason is because the American force, okay, which was basically farmers and businessmen that just joined, they weren't in a formal army, but joined Washington, they enlisted for 6 months. And so July 4th, 1776, you're coming up to January, so they have now the right to leave. So a major obstacle for General Washington will be to talk them into not going home, okay, the remaining group, because here it's the dead of winter. The English are not going to attack, and they're over here. But George Washington needed a victory because if they would lose any more, it would basically be over. To challenge his troops to believe and not desert, General Washington had Thomas Paine's pamphlet, The American Crisis, and he read it to the troops. Now, he's an interesting fellow because Thomas Paine was a hero in the American Revolution, but then he followed atheistic viewpoint. And if you were in a different course that I've shared here, I actually read to you Benjamin Franklin's letter warning Paine about going this route that he was going. And as a matter of fact, he would end up at his death, not that no one wanted to bury him. They just had to bury him in in a pauper's field. Here is a little bit of what George Washington read, meaning Thomas Paine's pamphlet, to the soldiers to encourage them to stay. Now, as soon as I start, some of you will recognize this. Quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in the crisis, shrink from the service of their country. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. In the 15th century, the whole English army was driven back by a few broken forces headed by a woman, Joan of Arc." Now remember, Jersey, New Jersey, he closes with this: "Would that heaven might inspire some Jersey maid to spirit up her countrymen." So that was Thomas Paine's, what he read, and that immediately coalesced or solidified their desire to follow George Washington and into what he was about to have them do. With the password of this military operation being, quote, "victory or death." That's what George Washington named it. Okay, he knew with the depleted troops, he knew he was doing something daring that had to work, and so he named it "victory or death." General Washington and his troops crossed the ice-filled Delaware River in a blizzard on Christmas Day Eve in 1776. This violent snow and hailstorm worked to their favor by inducing the enemy's sentries to cover any reducing the visibility to zero. Now this is important because this is the first providential intervention by God, because they didn't know that that was going to be the weather condition. They didn't have the Weather Channel back then, and they were planning this and decided to do it on that. Now some people say, and I read this historically, but then some people disagree with it, that George Washington's impetus was the knowledge that the Hessians, which were the German mercenaries, were heavy drinkers, and it being the Christmas day, they would be all drinking, and they would be somewhat inebriated, and it would be easier. But then other historians say that it's not really true. It was the day he picked to do it. And so again, this violent snow and hailstorm worked to their favor by inducing the enemy's sentries to seek cover and reducing the visibility to near zero. Marching towards Trenton. Now here's Trenton up here. And there's the Delaware River where he crossed. And from there to Trenton is 9 miles. So it's violent snowstorm. And they're about to attack, but they've got to walk 9 miles to get there to do the attack, which will then make it the next day when they do the attack.
Pastor, was this in the nighttime?
Yeah. Christmas Day Eve, meaning on Christmas Day, but the evening of it. On December 26th, that's the next day, they attacked. In less than 1 hour, General Washington's men secured the victory, capturing approximately 1,000 Hessian troops and only suffering 3 injuries to the Continental Army. But amongst those 3, one individual almost died because of a severed artery up near his neck, but he would become the 5th president of the United States, James Monroe. Okay, of those 3 that were injured. Henry Knox, everybody's familiar with Henry Knox now, right? Okay, Henry Knox recounted the Battle of Trenton as follows, quote, "The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump will sound." So they interpreted things biblically and in terms of patriotically also, but we see this week after week. They're always putting it within the framework as Christians of what they're expecting or what they're seeing. The reason why the Hessians were hurried and frightened and confused was because they weren't expecting this, okay? That in the snowstorm, here would come the American army. Knox concluded, quote, "Providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise." Washington led his troops and the Hessian prisoners now back the 9 miles to the Delaware River where they crossed, across the river, and brought the captives back there. Okay? But, let me go a step further. Hearing of the American victory at Trenton, an enraged British general, Cornwallis, sent 8,000 troops to confront General Washington. So here's Cornwallis. He's up here at Princeton with his troops. They hear about what's happened here at Trenton, and now the reason Cornwallis is here is because that's where the battle's second Trenton's going to take place. They travel down here. It's 12 miles distance between Princeton and Trenton. Okay. General Washington again crossed the Delaware River and regrouped at Trenton, and this will be called the Second Trenton, the second battle. Washington's men held their own against Cornwallis' troops, and he did it by having he planted some of his men along this line that they were coming down, and the little skirmishes that they would cause, meaning the Americans would cause, would slow this larger army from getting down there. So that was going on. But as the British troops increased in size as it got to Trenton, Washington had to make a decision because they really believed that they were going to be outnumbered. Okay, so Washington made a bold decision and a brilliant move. Washington removed his troops from Trenton, skirting the flank. Now here's the flank. So here, if you see these arrows here, instead of going directly into where Cornwallis was bringing them down, they went off this right flank all the way up to Princeton to then attack from at the rear. Okay. Another thing he did to fool the British, Washington left his Trenton campfires going into the night. So even though they left everything as if it was totally occupied. That kept Cornwallis from attacking at night. He saw all the campfires, so he planned to go ahead in the morning and attack. But by the time morning had come, they were already up at Princeton getting ready to attack from the rear. A providential change in the weather. Again, here comes the weather again. A providential change in the weather, which turned brutally cold, helped them outflank the British without notice. The next morning, January 3rd, 1777, Washington attacked the rear of the British troops. The January 3rd, 1777 attack witnessed one of the most miraculous days of the American Revolution. General Washington's aide-to-chief was Colonel John Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was ordered by General Washington to bring up the troops from the rear of the column. At that moment, the British broke through the line of Brigadier General Hugh Mercer. General Mercer would later die as a result of the attack. And what that caused was confusion. And this is so typical and why in war you want to go after the leaders. As a matter of fact, some of the British officers thought that they'd killed George Washington because of the way that Mercer was dressed. They thought they had shot and basically killed him. When Colonel Fitzgerald then returned to General Washington, the general was not there. Looking around, the colonel witnessed Washington attempting to rally Mercer's bewildered troops. In other words, you attack the lead guy because then it causes confusion, whether it's the British troop or the American troop. Unless you're extremely well trained and tested, when your leader goes down, it'll tend to cause confusion, disruption, and that's when the attack will be pressed by the side that has killed or wounded the leader. After several failed attempts with the frightened soldiers, Washington reined up his horse and raced within 30 yards of the enemy. Now, I've read this account from multiple historians. It always comes out the same. Basically, what you have is you've got Mercer's troops in disarray. They are starting to leave in a panic, and George Washington will now come up on his horse within 30 yards of the enemy and looking at his troops. As a matter of fact, here's one of the accounts. The troops, Washington raced within 30 yards of the enemy. Then he turned his horse and faced his disheveled troops, encouraging them to engage the enemy. So he's right in the middle. The troops immediately rallied, meaning the American troops, forming into line. Now, the weapons of both armies leveled for engagement, with General Washington beckoning on his troops to fire right in the middle, thus becoming a target from both sides. Colonel Fitzgerald recounts that he was horrified, and dropping the reins upon his horse's neck, drew his hat over his face so he wouldn't see General Washington die. A roar of musket fire from both armies followed, and then a shout. Colonel Fitzgerald raised his eyes to witness his commander flying upon his white horse amidst the musket smoke, alive, unharmed, and without a wound, waving his hat and cheering his comrades in the pursuit. You want to show this picture? This was a painting that was done right after this event, depicting it. There's George Washington waving his hat, and the troops have favorably responded to them. And so then that will cause, Colonel Fitzgerald mounted his horse, heedless of the dead and dying in his way, and came to the side of his chief, exclaiming, "Thank God," this is quote, "Thank God, your excellency is safe." At that moment, Fitzgerald began weeping like a child for joy. A calm Washington affectionately grasped the hand of the aide and then ordered, quote, "Away, my dear colonel, and bring up the troops. The day is our own." Now, if you remember back at the Battle of Monongahela back in 1755-56, at that battle, you recall that George Washington was on a horse, and he was taking the instructions back and forth to the people as they were getting annihilated, and that's where he had the 4 bullets go through his jacket, okay, and 2 horses shot out from underneath him. So if you think of that, and then you think of this, you see the courage that he had, okay? Historians have said that this event, this one here, sealed the relationship of all of his soldiers that would be with him all the way through the war and then extend afterwards. I remember going to Mount Vernon. Who's been to Mount Vernon here? Okay, so 2 of us have been. Gee, and the 3 o'clock was like 8 other people have been there. There were travelers there. But when we went there, we heard the story of how when George Washington retired from the presidency, even though it didn't have a lot of time, he would have individual soldiers that were in battles with him come up to visit him on a continual basis, because the love that was there, that was experienced through these battles. But then again, it wasn't just his courage, it was that they knew something was different because of the providential intervention by God, that they knew that this person was different and chosen by God. It is documented that a Pennsylvania soldier who saw the entire scene, this one here at Princeton, commented, quote, "When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, his important life hanging as it were by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths lying around him, believe me, I thought not about myself." So because of his courage, he was able to bring the troops together so that they could win the battle. Washington then commanded his troops to lower their bayonets and charge the British. Washington's invigorated troops drove the British from the field and won the victory. This was Washington's first actual victory over the British on a field of battle. He captured the Hessians and so forth, but actually in kind of warfare on the battlefield. Recall they lost at Monongahela. This was his first victory. And this is where I put in the comment, Frederick the Great of Prussia called the 10 days from December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, quote, "the most brilliant in the world's history." Ezra Stiles, president of Yale, and he was the 7th president of Yale, so you see how long Yale's been around. The 7th president of Yale stated in a Connecticut election address, quote, "In our lowest and most dangerous estate, we sustained ourselves against the British army of 60,000 troops, commanded by the ablest generals Britain could procure throughout Europe. with a naval force of 22,000 seamen and about 80 men of war, that's battleships. Independence was sealed and confirmed by God Almighty. In the victory of General Washington at Trenton and in the surprising movement and Battle of Princeton, who but a Washington, inspired by heaven, could have struck out the great movement and maneuver at Princeton? And I love this final statement. The United States are under peculiar obligations to become a holy people unto the Lord our God. In other words, they all recognize it. They recognize that God was intervening. This was not, I mean, this really, as historians look back, I remember at the 8 years ago when I spoke about George Washington at the Mayor's Breakfast, and I brought in one of the historians, and he wasn't necessarily a Christian. He wasn't talking Christian terms. But he said this whole thing was, the whole American Revolution was a miracle that it ever worked, okay? Because of these occasions of war or battles that happened after each other, that if any one of them had gone the wrong way, the American Revolution would have been over. And now this I promised you last week because I wanted you to see how the esteem for Washington grew, and by the time the war was over, what was written about him. So now we're going to go from 1777, the first week of 1777, to 1783 at the conclusion of the war. And again, Dr. Stiles of the president of Yale wrote this. He reflected upon General Washington when preaching before the Connecticut General Assembly, and also there was Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Governor Trumbull served in the first, second, and third United States Congresses, including serving as Speaker of the House, and then served 11 terms as the Governor of Connecticut. In his message entitled "The Future Glory of the United States," Dr. Stiles exclaimed, quote, "O Washington, how do I love that name! How have I often adored and blessed thy God for creating and forming thee, the great ornament of humankind. Upheld and protected by the omnipotent, by the Lord of hosts, thou hast been sustained and carried through one of the most arduous and most important wars in all history. The world and posterity will with admiration contemplate thy deliberate, cool, and stable judgment, thy virtues, thy valor, and heroic achievements, as far surpassing those of a Cyrus." Now, isn't that interesting? Because if you recall back in at least 2018, they were comparing President Trump with Cyrus. Why? Cyrus was a great conqueror in the 6th century BC, okay? And because of his ability to conquer, and there was a comparison made back in 1783 of it being to George Washington. Thy virtues, thy valor, and heroic achievements as far surpassing those of a Cyrus, whom the world loved and adored. The sound of thy fame shall go out into all the earth and extend to distant ages. Thou hast convinced the world of the beauty of virtue, for in thee this beauty shines with distinguished luster. Those who would not recognize any beauty and virtue in the world beside will yet reverence it in thee. And again, they preached in Old English back then, okay? They were from England. There is a glory in thy disinterested benevolence. What does this mean, disinterested benevolence? He carried himself with a meekness. He carried himself with, he was doing what he was needed to do. And so he wasn't taking things upon himself or glorying in himself. And so he seemed to be disinterested in just how benevolent he was being in his relationship to people. There is a glory in thy disinterested benevolence, which the greatest characters would purchase, if possible, at the expense of worlds, and which may excite indeed their emulation, but cannot be felt by the venal great, who think everything, even virtue and true glory, may be bought and sold, and trace our every action to motives terminating in self. But thou, O Washington, forgottest thyself when thou lovest thy bleeding country. Not all the gold of Ophir, that's off of a poem, not all the gold of Ophir, nor a world filled with rubies and diamonds could affect or purchase the sublime and noble feelings of thine heart in that single self-moved act, when thou renounced the rewards of generalship and heroically took upon thyself the dangerous as well as arduous office of our generalissimo. Now, what's the difference between a general and a generalissimo? A generalissimo is a person that is given total authority. So if you have a general in the Army, generalissimo is in charge of the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force. He's in charge. Remember back to Philadelphia when things were going badly, and so all of a sudden everybody headed out of town and they left one note: everything's in the hands of George Washington. Until you get further notice. That's the respect they had for George Washington, but at the same time, it was very disorganized during that time, the American cause. And this at a solemn moment when thou didst deliberately cast the die for the very dubious alternative of a gibbet or a triumphal arch. Now, a gibbet, does anybody know what a gibbet is? Or a gibbet or gibbet? It's the hangman's noose. It's the wood construction that you hang people on. So what it's saying is he was not moved by the fact he was going to die and be hanged, okay, if the British won, okay, nor for a triumphal arch. He was not swayed by either the greatest honor or the worst death, okay, the very dubious alternative of a gibbet or a triumphal arch, but beloved and shielded and blessed. Check this out. Now he's going to say what his motives were. But beloved and shielded and blessed by the great Melchizedek, the King of righteousness as well as peace, thou hast triumphed gloriously. Such has been thy military wisdom in the struggles of this arduous conflict, such the noble rectitude, amiableness, and mansuetude. Okay, mansuetude is I had to look it up. It means meekness. Okay, that's just an old word for meekness. Of thy character, something is there so singularly glorious and venerable, thrown by heaven about thee, that not only does thy country love thee, but our very enemies stop the madness of their fire in full volley. What's he talking about there? He's referring to a specific event. When do you remember that somebody stopped shooting at George Washington because they knew that something else was going on here? It was the Battle of Monongahela. It was the Indian chief that came back 15 years later and said, I never miss. I shot at you 11 times. I had my braves shoot at you, and so I stopped him. I said, whoop, whoop, whoop. No, this man will never die in battle. He's under protection of the Great Spirit. And so that prophecy came true. But again, here's Dr. Stiles referring back to it because all this history, they knew what George Washington's history had been. All these things that they get word back on, that something supernatural was going on. And that's why when people ask me, people say, well, Pastor Roger, you sound like a nationalist. I'm not a nationalist. I'm not in favor of our country because of some intrinsic worth that we'd have over any other country. I'm a supernaturalist, though. In other words, when I see God involved and God ordering the paths, then I'm going to promote that because that's speaking of God's wonderful works. And it's giving the honor due to those that came before us and giving honor to God for the fact that it was He who actually won the American Revolution. Our troops played their part, but it was God's intervention time after time after time that enabled us to become a free country. He goes on in conclusion to say, Dr. Stiles is now going to move the conversation about himself towards George Washington. Permit a humble minister of the blessed Jesus, who though at a distance has vigilantly accompanied thee through every stage of thy military progress, has watched thine every movement and danger with a heartfelt anxiety and solicitude, and with the most sincere and earnest wishes for thy safety and success, has not ceased day nor night to pray for you and to commend you and thy army to God. Condescend to permit him to express, meaning now he's referring to the third person to himself. When he says condescend to permit him, he's meaning himself, okay? Condescend to permit him to express his most cordial congratulations and to share in the triumphs of thy bosom on this great and joyous occasion. 1783, end of the war. We thank the Lord of hosts that has given his servant to see his desire upon his enemies and peace on Israel. So he's using that phraseology there from the Bible to compare now as Israel in their triumph, the joy we have experienced here on American soil. Okay? And when thou shalt now at length retire from the fatigues of 9 laborious campaigns to the tranquil enjoyment, to the sweetness and serenity of domestic life. Mount Vernon is a beautiful place. It is beautiful, majestic, and to think of a person retiring to there, that's what he's speaking to. To the sweetness and serenity of domestic life, may you never meet the fate of that ornament of arms and of humanity, the great Belisarius. Now, who can tell me who Belisarius was? No, but well. Let me say it this way. When Dr. Stiles is giving this message, he's covering a large part of ground, okay? And so he started with the 6th century BC with Cyrus. Now he's going to the 6th century AD with Belisarius. Now Belisarius was considered, has been written as the last Roman general, okay? At the end of Roman conquest and so forth. But he fell in with this is debated, but I'm going to share it because that's what he's referring to here. They believe that under Justinian, and him fell out of favor, and Justinian put out his eyes. And so you can see some great paintings, and it's called the blind beggar Belisarius, because that he's referring to here when he says, may you never meet the fate of that ornament of arms and of humanity, the great Belisarius, but may a crown of universal love and gratitude, of universal admiration, and of the universal reverence and honor of thy saved country rest and flourish upon the head of its veteran general and glorious defender, until, by the divine Jesus, whom thou hast loved and adored, and of whose holy religion thou art not ashamed, thou shalt be translated from a world of war to a world of peace, liberty, and eternal triumph. So that's how he was looked upon. Okay. Now you can see when we see 2 years ago when we see people rioting in the streets and pulling down statues and all this stuff, you realize how shallow these people are. And it's not, and I really can relate to the fact of what Jesus said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Because when in our public schools, which is the largest majority of people in our nation go to a public school, when in 62 and 63 and then in 80, when prayer, Bible study, the 10 Commandments are stripped from the walls, as soon as you do that, then you're not going to be giving stories about God's miraculous intervention. You're not going to talk about what the founders wrote about the providential care. That's why history, even American history, is just a shell of it, because there's so much God in it that they can't share. So then they have to share it in more of a chronological order and a more economic order instead of telling the truth behind it. And so when I see people just going crazy, I realize they have no honor, no humility towards those that came before us. When we talk about these battles, it was it last week? Who was it? One of our generals that died was bayoneted 7 times. Another of the leaders was bayoneted 13 times. Now think about that. You're talking about hand-to-hand conflict. You're talking about no penicillin. You're talking about you could get a minor thing, but if it got infected, you're going to die. Okay, this is a lot of it was hand to hand bayonet. That remember what I just read to you. George Washington said, "Lower your bayonets and charge the British." Okay, so when you think about that, what people have done, not just in the American Revolution, in the Civil War, in the First World War, Second World War, what people did in terms of giving up their lives, giving up their youth and adulthood, and died on battlefields, domestic and foreign. That should produce in people, number one, a humility, and number two, an honor and respect towards those that came before us, so that we would be more sober in what we do in this life. And so, again, I think one of the powerful things about looking at history from the providential sense of God's intervention and seeing what the people sacrificed, it not only illuminates the fact that we should be both thankful and proud to be in one nation under God, the only nation that's ever begun with the Judeo-Christian, I think the Old and New Testament, and going back to 1607 again, at Cape Henry, when the covenant that we entered into has been going on, and that is that we would be a light on a hill and we would share the gospel with the nations. Now, certainly, we have gone astray, okay, in many different areas. But one of the beauties of what we're experiencing right now, and I'm sure you're going to find things that you don't like that the present administration does, whether we're totally knowledgeable of what's going on or not. But again, I really believe that we are in a reforming period of time where the present administration is attempting to take us back in terms of to some more moralistic times, more looking at things not through invented ideologies that seem to be popular at the time, but in reality are anti-biblical and are not blessed by God. I think that what we're seeing right now is an ability to reform, a renaissance, as it were. And I don't think it's just happening here in the United States. I believe it's happening in other countries right now. And I know that to be a fact, not only in Argentina, but some things we're seeing in Italy and on the brink in Canada and Germany. So, and again, things can go any way, but it's really important in our prayers to be praying for the glory of the Lord to fill the earth. Because that's the ultimate of what we're looking for, is the glory of the Lord to fill the earth. And anyway, so at that point, it's time for questions. George, would you come up here and hand out to everybody? This is, and we'll go over this. It's only one pager. Whenever I give the synopsis, it's only one pager. And then we'll ask questions, because this will kind of frame it. Yes, if you could. Grace would probably help you if you want to give half to her. But that'll be faster, George, is what I'm saying. It'll be faster. Just cut it in two and give her half, would you?
I'm trying to get it out.
Okay.
I gave her more.
Okay, that's fine. All right, we'll get those out, then we'll go through them real quickly. We're still within the hour, and that's what I'm always trying to do. This sermon that Dr. Stiles gave was typical of how the people felt about George Washington. Okay, let's go through it and then we'll open up for questions. Now, why did I say, oh, George, your mom needs one. Why is it called, why did I entitle tonight's No Equal? Huh? Yes, but what does it mean? No equal. It's George Washington. There was no equal. He had no equal. He was able not just to become the father of our country, but he made it through all these battles unscathed. He never got even wounded. Through all these hand-to-hand conflict, and he wasn't sitting on the mountain looking down and instructing. He got on that horse and went right in the middle of it and told his guys, come on, we can win this thing, and put himself in harm's way. Because as he wrote to his mother and as he wrote to his brother, I don't know who else he wrote to, he knew that God had placed him in the position that God, he said, Mom, the God that saved me in the past things is going to get me in this through these also. Okay? And I do see a similarity in terms of the belief that has come on Donald Trump. He believes that God is really, and I believe he's sincere, that God has put him in this position at this time. And as I said before, God has put each of us here at this time too. That he expects of us to be able to be part of what he's wanting to do. And that's to educate people, and again, that's why I really encourage y'all. You got a lot of, someone just shared with me that they said to their son, did you ever hear about this? No, where'd you hear about that? And so then they got him a sheet and everything. This is, there are people that are willing to be educated, are willing to believe something besides a bunch of the lies that go out. Okay, no equal. 10 days, December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777. Frederick the Great of Prussia said, quote, the most brilliant in the world's history. Between August 27th, which is the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, or the Battle of Long Island, okay? Between August 27th, 1776, and December 24th, 1777, the American Army was chased out of New York, New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. Think of the Delaware River. It's right in the winter. The British are not going to pursue any further. It was dangerous to go across that river, okay? On December 25th, Washington crossed the Delaware River. They were not expecting that. Okay, it was left. That camp in Trenton was left in the Hessians, the mercenaries' hands. Okay. On December 25th, Washington crossed the Delaware River in an attempt to take Trenton, New Jersey. With God providing a nor'easter, Washington's troops were able to catch the Hessians off guard and capture 1,000 Hessian prisoners and take Trenton. That's Trenton number 1. Okay. He then returned with the prisoners across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. Then 4 days later, on December 30th, his troops again crossed over the Delaware to Trenton to defend their victory against 8,000 British soldiers. That's Trenton number 2. Okay. But now we're going to bring Princeton into it because of this remarkable move that George Washington did by outflanking them. And God will again change the weather, make it brutally cold, so everybody's huddled up there and they are able to do it, get by them without them being noticed. He then returned with the prisoners across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. Then on December 30th, his troops again crossed over the Delaware to Trenton number 2 to defend their victory against 8,000 British soldiers. Here, Washington outsmarted the attacking British and marched 12 miles to Princeton and attacked from the rear. Washington proved, now this we're referring to his on the horse, turning and facing his men in between the British and the Americans. Washington proved that in courage and providential protection, he had what? No equal. Okay. Yeah. Questions?
Hey, how many troops did he have when he went to fight the 8,000 men? How many?
2,000. Okay.
He 8,000 men with 2,000.
Well, remember this. Okay, this is something that's fluid because when this was considered by historians to change the war. Okay, because it was their first victory, and so you would have when he went back, took the 1,000 prisoners, and people heard of this and all. His army started to grow, and so throughout the war it would grow and then go down and grow and then go down until the end that they had equal numbers of the British when we get to Cowpens and the Three Rivers.
Was the United States back then?
I don't know the exact number. I don't know, but you got to think of it as really the eastern seaboard, up through Pennsylvania. When the Louisiana Purchase would happen later, I'm talking about, what was the date on that? 18, I forget. Then you would have the expansion of what would become out to Missouri, North Dakota, and so forth. But at this time, you're really talking about the northeast, eastern, southern states. So I'm sorry, I don't know the number. Somebody Google it.
It says 2,148,000.
In what year?
In actually 1770.
Okay.
In 1780, there were 2,700,000.
See, I wouldn't have guessed that many people. That's a lot of people, yeah. But I wouldn't have guessed that many.
They could pull 100,000 for battle.
Well, you know, and again, it was growing, but I don't know by that kind of numbers. What other questions or thoughts?
It's mind-boggling that it snowed on Christmas because I'm from Jersey and we got snow every other day but Christmas.
Then that's something. Yeah. Now, do you know where the Delaware River is? And do you know where Trenton and Princeton? Have you traveled in those two cities?
I grew up like 60 miles from Trenton,
Okay.
but I didn't learn this.
No, that and again, what year were you in high school? What years?
Oh, that's a good thing. So I was a junior in '76.
See, you're way past 62, 63. God's gone.
Oh, yeah. And
That's why you never heard these.
1976 was, 1976 was a big deal.
Yes, it was.
But I didn't learn this.
Yeah, because God had been in the late 40s. David Barton puts this. I think it was the one who heard this one. In the late 40s, you had a switch because of the degrading of God. You know, in the course of the things that were going on, and that it was changed from a providential viewpoint of American history to an economic viewpoint of American history. So, and really this degrading, you could take it back to 1895, okay? But then in the 1920s, a real degrading started. But then when you get to 60, you've got the people that were in the teachers' colleges that had graduated, taught, and some of them were in politics, and they moved into things like the Supreme Court. And so that is why when you get to the late 40s, that's when things really started changing. And then the fruit of it was 62, 63, 80. That's the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, it's interesting because my brother is 8 years older than me. Nothing there.
And see, I was in no. See, I was in elementary school in the 50s, and we used to travel to Mount Vernon, Monticello, Washington, D.C. I didn't hear these stories. And because, again, and this is the mid-50s, but it's not high school. It's more like kids, going on nice field trips. But I remember Monticello and Mount Vernon, how beautiful both of them were. And the thing that was different about the two, Monticello, Thomas Jefferson was quite an inventor. And so when you go into there, you see all these inventions, these clocks and things that he was, even the way he made his bed so he could get out of his bed and his writing table was right there. Just really unique things.
I was there this summer and I was sharing with Donna. I got this picture. I'm standing there and I look up and there's a painting with with this woman with a platter and a man's head on it.
And what is it of?
Well, my first thought was, what did her husband do? And then I thought maybe it would be like John the Baptist.
That sounds right. The reason I was asking, there is a very famous painting, an event that happened. Now, in Trenton, no, in Trenton too. What was happening there? Princeton, okay, where Princeton is, and the college was there then, and there was a very famous. There's a historical fact, but it's argued, and that was that one of the cannonballs went into, and I can't remember the hall. Where the British were. Okay, the British were in this hall at what we call, at Princeton. And they said that one of the cannonballs hit a picture of, I believe it was King George the second or third, and it knocked his head off. So that's why I asked that.
Anyway, that guy had a bad day.
Both of them had a bad day, yes. Yeah. So, if I could close with this thought, and then any questions I'm open for, but the two things I want you to take away from this is, number one, the wonderful works of God, the miracles. Why we do this week after week is the miracles, because that lets you know that you have a real good reason to be thankful and to realize that you have a place and a position that God wants you in terms of restoring what God intends for this nation. And then secondly, I think that it really should make us ponder. JC was here in the first service, and he said when he just went back with us to Washington, D.C., he was flying over, as they were landing, they came over Arlington. and with all the graves and everything, and it was just overwhelmed by the Lord with a sense of all those graves and the peoples that have gave up their lives, for us. And again, it's so sad, cavalier, even for people to just disregard that and not to have a healthy respect, honor, and humility towards those that came before us.
That, if you ever get to DC, that is an amazing tour of Arlington.
Yeah.
It's life changing.
I went there as a kid, but that's all I can remember.
I went as a kid, and then I wanted to go a couple years ago. We were back there and didn't go. And then this year, Jim does not like cemeteries, but I made him go.
Uh-huh.
And it was like life changing for
Oh,
him.
good. Praise the Lord. Yeah. Anybody else? Any questions? Now we're over by 3 minutes. Everybody, good night. See you next week.
For the stamp.
You're very welcome for the stamp. If some of you, it may be the start of a stamp collection, because who knows, you might end up getting another one at another battle. Who knows?